Hello, and welcome to Recipes with Ben. In today's video, I'm going to be breaking down all items you need to start brewing, from the brew day all the way to packaging, and I'll talk about some worthwhile upgrades along the way. So with all that said, let's get into the video. In the world of homebrewing, there are two methods for heating up liquid on the brew day. Option 1 is to use a propane as a direct heat source, and option 2 is electricity that powers a heating element and then is regulated typically by a temperature probe. Regardless of the method, you'll need some kind of kettle, aka a big metal pot to heat up water, and then at the end, the wort. If we start with propane at the basic level, you'll need a pot that can hold about double the volume of beer you want to brew. So for a 5-gallon batch, that's about a 10-gallon kettle. Then for the heat source, there's a ton of different types of propane burners out there, but the basics are that propane will provide the heat at the bottom of the kettle and thus heat the liquid at the bottom. For propane, due to safety reasons, it's needed to be done outside or in an extremely well ventilated area. Now, the simplest method that requires the least amount of brewing equipment with this is the brew in the bag method. We use a mesh bag to hold all the grains, and after that, you just pull them from the kettle, and the liquid that's trapped inside the grains will drain from the bag into that same vessel. You can optionally squeeze the bag if you want to try to get as much liquid out, and then after that, with all the wort inside the kettle, you can just boil the wort to continue on the brew day. Just be fair warned that you can lose temperature over the course of the mash that can cause a decrease in efficiency due to the metal not being very good at retaining heat. One method that's popular to insulate this to keep the heat inside during the mash is to wrap it with some kind of sleeping bag or thick blankets. As the brew setup becomes more advanced, it will start to look very similar to commercial brewing. We use a 3-vessel system, where one of the vessels is a hot liquor tank, the second is the mash tun, and the last one is a kettle for boiling. In this setup, it requires either the use of gravity or pumps to move liquid from one vessel to the next, from the hot liquor tank over to the mash tun, and then finally into the kettle, and then boiling off. Some home brewers have built brew towers so the strike water can flow over the grains into the mash and then finally down into the kettle using gravity and no pumps. If you're looking to spend more money, you can always upgrade by adding pumps to this and additional hoses that will fit your kettle. For electric, the setup can be exactly the same, except the kettle typically has a built-in heating element that heats up the liquid for the mash, and with a built-in temperature probe, it can cycle the heating element on and off during the mash and boil. The biggest thing that you want to make sure is that your outlet can supply enough voltage to power the kettle during these times. For some electric systems, this can take slightly longer to heat the liquid compared to, say, propane, but in my experience with a gig wort, I didn't notice a difference. I do know that there is, when you increase in scale for more liquid, propane is a lot hotter source and can heat up the liquid a lot faster. The last important item for the brew day is the method to cool down the boiling hot wort all the way down to the pitching temperature that's proper for the yeast. In my case, I use a metal wort chiller that pushes water from a hose through the chiller that's submerged in the kettle. And on the other side, I collect that water and reuse that for something like cleaning after the brew day or watering plants in my garden. So I no longer use my water coolers that I used to use as a mash tun. I now just use them to collect the water and store them post brew day for watering plants in my garden. There are other options out there for cooling wort, and these include plate chillers and immersion pumps and other ways. Now that everything's cooled down and ready for fermentation, let's talk about fermentation vessel. In the world of homebrewing, fermenters are made of 3 types of materials. This is either food-grade plastic, glass, or stainless steel, and each has their own benefits and disadvantages. Starting with plastic, these are the lightest material, and like this brew bucket I have here, it's typically the cheapest. These type of brew buckets typically come with a lid that seals the brew bucket tight and comes with a pre-drilled hole on top of that lid that can fit an airlock, so when fermentation happens, all the gas will be driven off through this airlock. That's the next material fermenters that we'll talk about. And this can cost a little bit more than plastic buckets. Glass is the disadvantage of being the heaviest of the 3 types of materials and can be harder to clean than plastic in my experience. Also, glass can break the easiest of the 3. And if you drop it and it was filled with that delicious beer or the wort before fermentation, it really sucked to clean up, but also sucked to lose all of that. So the best way I recommend is using some kind of jacket to move this around to help A, so you don't throw out your back when you're lifting up, say, 5 or 10 gallons of beer, and B, make it less likely to slip out of your hands. This is a minor upgrade and is not required, but I have found it helpful in the past when I used to use glass fermenting. Lastly, we'll talk about stainless steel. Stainless steel is by far the most expensive of the 3 materials, but it's what commercial breweries use because it's also the most durable. All high-end fermenters that are out there are made of stainless steel. Depending on the brand, they allow for a ton of additional accessories and later upgrades as you use them. If you want to see more information about the stainless steel brew bucket that I use, I'll have a whole video doing that. It'll be linked down below. My advice to you is that if you're new to homebrewing and just want to see if this hobby is for you, I would just start with plastic and upgrade what works best for you as you go along. The bucket gets bad, but cheap enough to just replace. And I've since, upgraded from plastic to glass and now to stainless steel. I'd say that I still use plastic brew buckets all the time. I typically use them to hold sanitizer or cleaner. I will say I used to use glass to ferment in all the time. But if I was to start over and I was buying brand new equipment, I have one requirement that I should be able to take the lid off and get inside there and use a little elbow grease to clean the whole thing. Since glass typically has a pretty narrow hole at the top, it doesn't really allow for that, but you can buy some additional things to clean it out and assist in that process. The last thing we need for fermentation is a way to keep out oxygen while it's fermenting. And you can either use this with a 3-part airlock with a rubber stopper or a blow-off tube, where one of the ends of the blow-off tube is connected to the fermenter and the other end is submerged in liquid. The final stage of brewing is packaging. And just like commercial, there's 3 ways to package beer. The first is glass bottles, second is aluminum cans, and the third is kegging. If you start with bottles, you can either buy unlabeled bottles from your homebrew store or reuse beer bottles from a commercial brewery after you clean them and drink the beer that's inside. If you bottle your beer, you'll need to bottle condition it, and for that, you'll need a bottling bucket to assist in that process. This bucket has a valve at the bottom, and when connected to a bottling wand, it allows beer to flow into the bottles because of the pressure release valve at the bottom. If you bottle, you also need to add priming sugar to the beer so the yeast can re-ferment in the bottles and carbonate the beer on top of that. Next, after it's filled with your beer, you'll need to cap it with bottle caps that you can buy and also seal it with a bottle capper. Then you'll wait 3 to 4 weeks, test the beer for carbonation, and enjoy it once it's fully carbonated. Cans are very similar, but you'll need to buy a canning machine for that, and each time you want a can, you're going to have to buy brand new cans. I don't have much experience with this, but I just wanted to mention it as it's grown in popularity in recent years, both commercial and home brewing. Finally, it's on to kegging. Kegging, you'll need a CO2 tank, a CO2 regulator, gas tubing, a gray gas connect, a black liquid connect, a tap, liquid tubing, and of course, a keg. Something I also found really helpful is these type of clamps that screw down tight so you don't have any leaks in your tubing. If you need a whole video on how I keg beer, I'll link that video down below. And I find that kegging for me is the least stressful method because it only requires a single vessel that has to be cleaned and sanitized. It can also act as a nice secondary fermenter because it can be easily purged with CO2. This can help remove oxidation after fermentation. The other benefit of kegging is that it can be ready in as little as 48 hours after fermentation and is ready to be enjoyed then. If you want to upgrade, then getting a kegerator may be worth the investment, as this can also act as a fermentation chamber to help control temperature. The only downside I find with kegs is that it does require additional equipment to share with, say, friends and family, but not at your house drinking from the tap directly. Okay, and lastly, we'll talk about some other items that are super useful for home brewing and I also think are a necessity. First, we'll start with cleaning and sanitizing. And for that, I use PBW for cleaning and Star Sand for sanitizing anything that touches my beer. If you want to know the original and final gravity readings to determine the alcohol of your beer, you'll need a hydrometer, or you can use a refractometer. To get a hydrometer reading, you also need a 200 ml graduated cylinder, and for the refractometer, you'll need a pipette to be able to drop the liquid, then look at a light source to get a reading. Next I have is a brew spoon, and this just needs to be long enough to reach the bottom of the kettle. Stainless steel is nice, slotted is also recommended. These types of spoons are super useful for stirring the mash to eliminate dough balls, and can be used during the boil to stir in hops or other added material. Next, what you'll need is a way to transfer beer from one vessel to the next. That would be a siphon. This can be helpful to move beer from your fermenter to a bottling bucket or to a keg, and sometimes I like to use this to move it from the kettle to the fermenter. As I previously said, if you want to start brewing, I recommend just brewing in a bag because it requires the least amount of equipment. And these large mesh bags are awesome because it can be cleaned in a dishwasher or in a clothes washer after the brew day. Also, along the same lines, this small mesh bag is great for adding hops on brew day or being used for dry hopping, or lastly, for adding items that will be aged in a secondary fermentation. The other thing that I found extremely useful recently is use kind of squirt bottles, and I just fill this up with some sanitizer so I can sanitize anything that's going to touch my beer after the boil. This is great for spraying lids or spoons and other hard to reach places that will come in contact with your beer. And I almost forgot one of the most important things, and that's a thermometer, which is extremely useful on brew day to measure temperature during your mash and during your boil and when you're cooling down your wort to pitching temperature. With all that said, that's pretty much all the equipment. I'll list out kind of a price line for each thing on the screen right now. Thank you so much for watching. If you found any of this helpful, smash that like button. If you're new to the channel, click the bell, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. But with all that said, I'll see you in the next video.